alcoholism, drug addiction, cirrhosis of the liver, heart disease. Health problems take a while to develop, a few months to a few years before you're going to see them actually start setting in. Impairment problems, though, happen really fast, like getting involved in a crash or getting arrested or losing your job. Impairment problems happen if we have enough alcohol or drugs to where our brains are slowed down and we don't think, act, or respond as effectively as we normally do. Now, when I say impaired, I'm not talking about just being drunk or high. I'm talking about any change that happens to our mental or physical functioning that can cause the problem. Now, nobody plans on having impairment problems. This guy didn't get up this morning planning on doing a field sobriety test. But if we're going to prevent them, we do have to plan. And like we said earlier, they're not caused by the kind of people that we are. They're caused by a combination of our biology and our choices. Now, the same formula that we use to talk about health problems can also be used to talk about impairment problems. Only now, instead of focusing on a trigger level, now we're going to be focused on our tolerance level. The tolerance level is the point where we start to become impaired. Now, some people naturally have a higher tolerance level than other people do, meaning they can drink more alcohol before they start to feel impaired. So at first glance, it appears that people who have a high tolerance are protected from having impairment problems. But this is just an illusion. The truth is, people with high tolerance have even more problems with drugs or alcohol than people with low tolerance do. How do we know this? Well, the average VAC for impaired drivers is 0.15. If somebody with a low tolerance had a VAC of 0.15, that person would be passed out. So if you have a VAC of 0.15 or higher, and you're still able to drive a car, you have high tolerance.
Frustrated.
First thing that goes through
How
my
could
mind.
this happen to someone who seems to be handling alcohol so well? The answer lies in the nature of tolerance.
Tolerance is just a measure of how impaired we are at any VAC. We're each born with a different initial tolerance level. For example, if we have 3 people drinking alcohol for the first time, one person drinks a beer and goes to sleep. Second person might have a couple of beers and starts to feel kind of strange. Third person might have a 6-pack and wants to go find the party. So we're each born with different initial tolerance levels. Now, as we drink to where we become impaired, this causes our tolerance to rise. That's the biggest difference between trigger level and tolerance level. Trigger level, keep in mind, stays the same our whole lifetime, never ever changes. Our tolerance, though, goes up every time we drink to where we become impaired. Now, lots of people who have a high tolerance believe it's a good thing. They're proud of the fact they can drink most of their friends under the table. If you ask these same people, how do you know when you're impaired? How do you know when you've had too much? How do you know when you're drunk? They'll say things like, well, I stumble when I walk, or I slur my speech, or I start to feel sick. So in other words, as long as they're not stumbling or slurring their speech or feeling sick, they're really not impaired at all. But these are all 3 signs of major physical impairment. By the time you're at the point where you're stumbling, you're slurring your speech, you're feeling sick, you've been impaired a long time before that. When you're driving a car, you have to be able to do many more things than just walk straight or not slur your speech. You have to be able to see, understand, and process a lot of things all at once. This takes your higher brain functions. And it's these higher brain functions that are the very first part of your brain that start getting shut down when you start drinking alcohol. I'm talking about things like reaction time and peripheral vision. If you don't have those where they're supposed to be, when something like this happens, this could be a fatality if you don't respond exactly how you're supposed to when you're supposed to do it.
They're less impaired than they really are.
The tolerance makes us less sensitive to alcohol, which means we are less aware of how impaired we are. Not that we are less impaired, we're less aware of how impaired we are. It's one thing to get behind the wheel of a car knowing you're drunk out of your mind. It's another thing to get behind the wheel of a car thinking you're okay when really you're not. That's a very dangerous spot to be in. Let's think about another kind of tolerance. Let's think about tolerance to sugar. Here we have two people who drink coffee every single morning. The guy on the right has 4 teaspoons of sugar in his coffee every morning. The lady on the left doesn't have any sugar at all. What if we were to sneak and put 1/4 of a teaspoon of sugar in the lady's coffee on the left? Does she notice that? She would. What if we did the same thing to the guy on the right? Would he notice it? Why not?
He's already so overwhelmed.
Because his tolerance for sugar is already really, really high. The exact same thing is true with alcohol. If I have a low tolerance to alcohol, I'm going to notice any tiny minor changes that start happening when I start drinking. I'm going to notice my reaction time is slower than it usually is. I'm going to notice my peripheral vision is not as good as it usually is. If I have a high tolerance, I'm not going to notice that stuff. It doesn't mean it's not happening, because it is. I'm just not going to be aware of it. Here's an interesting statistic. On Friday and Saturday nights, between 12 a.m. and 1 a.m., 4% of the drivers on the road have a BAC of 0.10 or higher. 4%. If the same 4% of the drivers account for 46% of all fatalities that happen during that same time frame. And when these drivers are asked, did you feel like you were impaired? Did you have a buzz at all? Almost all of them said no, did not feel the least bit impaired. That's what mental impairment looks like. Chances are these drivers could have passed the field sobriety test just fine. They probably weren't slurring their speech or stumbling when they walked. Yet their higher brain functions, like their reaction time and peripheral vision, were being shut down, even though they weren't aware of it. So even though high tolerance seems like it should be a good thing, like it should protect us, in reality it is a risk factor. It's a liability. It puts us much more at risk than having a low tolerance does.